Look at this chain of dominoes. Once the first strikes the second, the rest of the sequence is locked in. The final piece falls not because it chose to, but because physics demanded it. For many, this is exactly what it feels like to view the human mind entirely through the lens of biology. This specific anxiety is known as neuro-existentialism. It is the dread that advancing neuroscience threatens our most basic sense of self. The fear stems from a strict reading of cause and effect. If the brain is entirely physical, then every thought, every single emotion and action you experience is the inevitable output of prior neural firings. Follow this logic to its end, and things like free will, choice, and meaning are exposed as biological illusions. They are internal signals masking a robotic, pre-programmed reality. In the past, philosophy insulated human agency through Cartesian dualism, the idea of a non-physical mind operating the physical machine of the body. Modern neuroimaging leaves no room for that concept. The brain is clearly doing the work. If we accept this deterministic interpretation, human achievement and moral responsibility are reduced to a passive sequence of neurochemical events. That neuro-existential dread relies on a reductive, eliminativist reading of the science. It assumes that explaining the mechanism eliminates the phenomenon. The raw data does not actually require this conclusion. A robust alternative exists in cognitive science. It relies on embodied, inactive, and predictive processing frameworks. These models argue that the brain is not a passive prediction engine sitting in a dark skull waiting for inputs. Rather, it is an active, self-organizing system that evolved to construct agency and adaptive order. This does not require a return to dualism. It roots agency firmly in measurable evolutionary biology. Shifting from an eliminativist framework to an inactive one changes how we view neuroscience. It moves from a threat to our humanity to the precise explanation of how human agency actually functions. This split-screen diagram illustrates two structural models of brain function. On the left is the traditional assumption that fuels existential dread. This is the brain as a passive causal chain. Sensory inputs arrive, neurons fire in sequence, and behaviors are blindly triggered. On the right is the inactive view. The brain is an active, self-organizing system. It generates intentional outputs to interact with its environment, measures the results, and dynamically updates itself to survive. This structural difference forces us to reevaluate decision-making, specifically the argument that prior causes eliminate choice. The eliminativist argues that because a decision is determined by a previous neural state, the organism had no real choice in the matter. The physical chain of events made the decision, not the person. But in the inactive framework, agency is a biological capacity. The whole organism selects actions based on real physical states that represent its own goals and internal values. Biological determinism does not erase choice. The deterministic physics of the brain are the tools the organism uses to execute autonomous, goal-directed behavior. A similar correction applies to the self. Neuro-existentialism often claims that a cohesive self is a biological fiction, a story the brain tells after the fact. Look at this wireframe model of an organism. The inactive framework defines the self not as a fiction, but as an adaptive, predictive model. The brain's primary job is to predict sensory inputs. It anticipates external variables to maintain survival. The self is the active, continuous simulation required to do this. The brain must map a clear boundary distinguishing its own physical form from the external world. Theoretical neuroscientist Carl Friston identifies this biological imperative as minimizing free energy. The system must constantly avoid surprise to maintain internal homeostasis against the environment. Because this predictive self model is required to keep the organism alive, the self is not a perceptual illusion. It is a tangible, hard-won evolutionary reality. The final pillar of neuro-existential dread is the assumption that the physical universe lacks inherent value, leaving humans to arbitrarily project meaning onto a blank reality. We can map the alternative using an intersecting network diagram. Meaning is not projected onto a blank world. It is enacted through physical interaction. First, we have interoceptive states. This is the raw internal data of the organism's biological needs, like hydration, temperature, or hunger. Second, we have affordances. These are the physical properties of the environment that offer opportunities for action to a specific organism. A value signal is generated precisely where a specific interoceptive need intersects with a specific environmental affordance. To a starving organism, a source of calories contains objective goodness. That value exists regardless of whether the universe as a whole is apathetic. Meaning is a measurable phenomenon, generated by the laws of biology interacting with the environment. Within the context of the organism, meaning is entirely real. If this inactive, predictive model is scientifically robust, why do so many philosophers and neuroscientists still push the existential dread? When researchers adopt a third-person perspective, observing raw data and chemical exchanges from the outside, they falsely conclude agency is absent. But agency isn't a localized object hidden in a specific brainfold. It's a holistic property of the entire system. Agency is an organism-relative property. It is something the system is, rather than a distinct component that it has. Neuroexistentialism persists because researchers confuse the external description of a mechanism with the internal reality of being that mechanism. To move past the anxiety, two assumptions must be dropped: the idea that raw neuroscience is the only valid description of reality, and the belief that the first-person experience is a useless byproduct. Theorists like Andy Clark, Anil Seth, and Jakob Howe emphasized that the biological brain's evolutionary purpose is to construct an agentic self capable of navigating a complex world. Because this process is biologically constructed, our capacity for choice is genuine. It is the literal function of the system, not a veil hiding a robotic truth. Neuroscience does not threaten who we are. It reveals the sophisticated mechanics of how we came to be. Embracing the embodied, predictive framework dissolves the dread. We are exactly the meaning-making, choice-making agents we experience ourselves to be.